Answer that question for us. We see a lot of emphasis on freight rail in South Africa, but not enough on passenger rail, and yet we say we've got a transport problem. Trying to invest in a bus rapid transit system, we could be doing a commensurate thing with the railway system.
Yes, I think there's a misconception here. There has been a big loss of passengers over the last 15 or 20 years in passenger rail, but in the last 5 years, passenger numbers have increased hugely. It's partly because prices have been frozen since the middle of 2003. But our company worked on a national commuter rail plan in 2004 to 06. Cabinet approved this, and this resulted in a tripling of capital investment. And between now and 2014, 15 billion rands is going to be spent in the commuter rail sector.
Right.
Now that's half of that's on rolling stock upgrades. So you're going to see improvements in the next few years.
Now it's reported that, for instance, Metro Rail's assets are dilapidated and distressed, and that's despite all these pledges from government to spend more on rail infrastructure. We're talking about privatizing assets that don't work properly, and then when you move into the commercialized space, it also doesn't work properly. Why is that?
Well, firstly, the report that you're referring to has got to do with the transfer of the long-distance passenger rail, Shosholoza Mail, out of Transnet and into what's now the Passenger Rail Agency of South Africa. Its assets come across formally not subsidized, but supported by Transnet, and on transfer it's discovered that it takes a lot of money to make this business work. The PRASA, Passenger Rail Agency of South Africa, is going to be putting some money into the long-distance passenger rail. It has got some good businesses. The Premier Class tourist train to Cape Town, which I travelled on in August, is a wonderful experience which I can recommend. But it is subsidised. However, the long-distance rail makes quite a lot of money on overnight sit-up services, people going home to former Transkei, Messina, Durban, even Nelspruit.
Right.
And these services are full, and if they had more trains, more people would ride them.
What's different between the long-distance rail and the shorter distance day-to-day use of the rails?
The shorter distance commuter trains are really contributing to the viability of the urban economy. They warrant a subsidy. The longer distance trains are competing with commercial intercity bus services and are far less viable in the long term.
Right. Now, the government has pledged and allocated 18 billion rands to the improvement of rail services, and consequently the transport budget has trebled. But why is there this persistent feeling that not enough is being done within the rail sector, be it commuter rail or long distance rail?
Investment takes time to feed through in the rail industry. I watched the whole privatization of rail in Britain, and it took at least 5 years before traction was gained, if you like. And after privatization, or even 10 years before lots of new trains started coming through. You can't just go to Pick and Pay and buy a train set. You've got to gear up the whole manufacturing industry again, and in another 3 or 4 years I think you'll start to see a lot more trains on the line.
Just in terms of investment models and funding models that are needed, what needs to happen? Because we're talking about government investment to the tune of 18 billion, we're talking about keeping subsidies where they're needed. And then in the United States, for instance, you see value investors like Warren Buffett putting their head on the block and saying, I'm investing in rail infrastructure because I see it as the future, especially in terms of industry. Why are we not having that here, and what could we do to get the private sector a lot more involved?
Well, two things. I'll distinguish between commuter rail and freight rail. On commuter rail, world best practice shows that we can cut costs and improve services dramatically if we bring private sector firms into operations. In the UK, after many years of decline, passenger numbers are now higher than they've ever been in history, and service levels are very good. And this is because they've privatized the operations. The infrastructure, scheduling and pricing is still partly in government's hands, but we can do what they've done. We can give the customers much better service if we cooperate with private sector operations. On freight, Warren Buffett is investing in long-distance intercontinental services, and these are viable in the USA. But in South Africa, we don't have the conditions, we don't have the distances, we don't have the volumes, and we don't have the will to give the private sector the head that it could bring and the viability it could bring.
Just a quick comment from you, Kobe, on this one. Private sector involvement in rail services, be it freighting, be it passenger rails. Wallace Kantai referred to problems in East Africa in terms of consolidating that space and privatizing it.
Look, again, we come back to the age-old adage here, and that is that government is there to provide the infrastructure for growth. Business is there to run business. And the question is, does government see a railroad as business or as infrastructure? I see it as a business, and one can make definitely a case for that as being infrastructure and needs government intervention in the past, but certainly today I see that as a business, and if you want to see the cost effectiveness out of it, run it as a business.